10-year-old girl vanishes on cruise ship. 15 years later, she suddenly appeared and did this. The gentle rocking of the cruise ship should have been soothing, but for Richard Harrington, it felt like the world was tilting off its axis. His daughter, Olivia, had been missing for exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes. The security team had searched every deck, every cabin, every nook and cranny where a 10-year-old girl might hide, but there was no trace of her. "Mr. Harrington." Captain Reynolds approached with a grim expression, his white uniform stark against the darkening sky. "We've completed another sweep of the vessel. I'm afraid we need to consider the possibility that..." "That what?" Richard's voice cracked, his usual composure crumbling. "That my daughter somehow vanished into thin air on your ship?" Behind him, his wife Margaret stood perfectly still, her designer dress immaculate despite the chaos of the day. Her face was a mask of concern, but her hands were steady as she gripped her leather handbag. "Richard, dear, perhaps we should contact our lawyer." The harmony of the seas had been Olivia's dream vacation. She'd spent weeks before the trip learning about the ship's water parks, the ice skating rink, and the roller skating disco. That morning, she'd been spinning around their luxury suite in her favorite yellow sundress, her dark curls bouncing as she chattered about the rock climbing wall she wanted to try. "Daddy, you promised you'd watch me climb all the way to the top," she'd said, her green eyes sparkling with excitement. Now, those words haunted him. He told her he had an important business call first. Just one call. He'd promised to meet her by the pool afterward. She never made it to the pool. The ship's security footage showed Olivia walking down Deck 12 at 11:47 a.m., heading toward the Royal Promenade. She passed the ice cream parlor, waved at a group of children her age, and then turned left toward the elevators. After that, nothing. She simply disappeared. As night fell, the Coast Guard arrived with helicopters and search vessels. The ship had been ordered to maintain its position while they conducted their search. Passengers gathered at the railings, watching the beams of light dance across the dark waters, whispering theories to each other. "I heard she's a rich man's daughter," one woman murmured to her companion. "You know what that means, ransom." Richard couldn't bear to hear more. He retreated to their suite, where Margaret was speaking quietly on the phone. "Yes, of course, we'll have the money ready," she was saying. "Just please keep us informed if..." She noticed Richard and quickly ended the call. That was Detective Santos. "They're expanding the search radius." Days turned into weeks. The ransom demand they'd expected never came. The FBI joined the investigation, interviewing every passenger and crew member, but no one could explain how a child could vanish from a ship in broad daylight. The media circus was relentless. "Cruise ship mystery. Harrington heiress vanishes at SEA," screamed the headlines. Reporters camped outside their Manhattan townhouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of the grieving family. Richard's business associates sent carefully worded sympathy cards. Margaret organized a charity fundraiser in Olivia's name, her smile never wavering as she addressed the cameras. But in a modest suburb of Seattle, far from the media frenzy, another story was unfolding. Sarah and James Brooks, a middle-class couple who'd always dreamed of having a child, received an unexpected visit that would change their lives forever. "She needs a home," the woman at their door said simply, gesturing to a frightened girl with haunted eyes. "She doesn't remember anything, not even her name. The doctors say it's trauma-induced amnesia." The Brooks didn't ask too many questions. Perhaps they should have, but the sight of the trembling child melted their hearts. They named her Emma, after Sarah's grandmother, and slowly, patiently, they began to heal her wounded spirit. Emma Brooks grew up loved and protected, with no memory of crystal chandeliers or ocean views. She excelled in school, played soccer, and helped her mother tend to their small garden. Sometimes, she had strange dreams of waves in a yellow dress, but they faded like mist in the morning light. Meanwhile, in New York, the Harrington case grew cold. The chief investigator suggested declaring Olivia legally dead, citing the statistical impossibility of her survival. Richard fought against it, but eventually, Margaret's practical nature prevailed. "We need closure, Richard," she said softly, placing a manicured hand on his arm. "We need to move on. For our son's sake." And so, on a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after her disappearance, Olivia Victoria Harrington was declared finished. Her parents held a memorial service at St. Patrick's Cathedral, when New York's elite gathered to mourn the tragic loss. Margaret wore black Chanel and dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Their 8-year-old son, Thomas, stood solemnly between them, too young to understand the weight of the empty casket. But Olivia wasn't dead. She was alive and well, growing up as Emma Brooks, completely unaware of her true identity. She had no idea that every year, on her birthday, Richard Harrington still set a place for her at the dinner table, or that in a sealed room in their mansion, her yellow sundress hung preserved in time, waiting for an owner who seemed lost forever. Life moved forward, as it always does. The Harringtons remained fixtures in New York society, their tragedy adding a fascinating layer to their mystique. Margaret threw herself into charity work, becoming known as a champion for missing children's causes. Richard buried himself in his business empire, his success tinged with a desperate edge. Thomas grew up in the shadow of his sister's ghost, watching his parents slowly drift apart. And in Seattle, Emma Brooks lived an ordinary life, unaware that she was the missing piece in an extraordinary puzzle. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and 15 years is a long time for truth to stay buried. The life she knew was about to shatter, and the past she couldn't remember was racing to catch up with her. The mystery of the girl who vanished on the harmony of the seas was far from over. In fact, it was about to explode in ways that would shake the Harrington family to its core, revealing that sometimes the greatest deceptions hide behind the most perfect facades. Emma Brooks sat frozen in front of her laptop, her coffee growing cold beside her. The missing persons database had been open for hours as she worked on her journalism assignment about cold cases in the Pacific Northwest. But now, staring back at her from the screen was something impossible. Her own face, 15 years younger. "Missing child Olivia Harrington," the headline read. "Last seen aboard the Harmony of the Seas cruise ship, June 15, 2010. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the details. The age progression photo beside the original looked eerily similar to her high school pictures. Same distinctive green eyes. Same small scar above her right eyebrow that she'd always assumed came from a childhood fall. "This can't be real," she whispered to her empty apartment. But deep down, something clicked into place. The recurring dreams of endless corridors and ocean waves, her inexplicable fear of cruise ships, the strange gap in her early memories that her therapist had attributed to childhood trauma. Emma called in sick to her job at the local newspaper and dove into research. She found archived news articles about the Harrington case, society photos of the wealthy family, and endless speculation about what had happened to the cruise ship heiress. One photo made her breath catch: 10-year-old Olivia at a charity gala, wearing a yellow dress and clutching a stuffed dolphin. Emma had the same dolphin, worn and faded, tucked away in her closet. She'd never known where it came from. The evidence mounted like a rising tide. Her birthday matched Olivia's. Her blood type, mentioned in the missing persons report, was the same rare type as Emma's. Even her habit of humming classical music pieces she'd never learned. The articles mentioned that Olivia had been a promising young pianist. With shaking hands, she pulled out her birth certificate, the one her parents had shown her when she needed it for college applications. Looking at it now with journalist's eyes, she spotted inconsistencies. The paper was wrong. The stamp looked artificial. This document, like her entire identity as Emma Brooks, was a carefully constructed lie. She confronted her parents, the only parents she'd ever known, over dinner at their modest Seattle home. Sarah Brooks burst into tears before Emma could even finish showing them the evidence. James Brooks gripped his wife's hand, his face ashen. "We thought we were protecting you," Sarah sobbed. "The woman who brought you to us said you were in danger, that you needed a safe home where no one would find you. We loved you so much, we didn't ask the questions we should have. We never knew you were Olivia Harrington," James added quietly. "We just knew you were a scared little girl who needed a family." Emma, or Olivia, felt her world spinning. The Brooks had loved her, protected her, given her a beautiful life. But they'd also been part of keeping her from her true identity, even if they hadn't known the full truth. After weeks of private investigation and DNA testing to be absolutely certain, she finally gathered the courage to contact the Harringtons. The family's lawyer responded within hours, arranging a meeting at their Manhattan mansion. The reunion should have been joyous. Emma had imagined tears of happiness, warm embraces, the healing of a 15-year wound. Instead, she walked into an atmosphere thick with tension. Richard Harrington, now in his 60s but still commanding in his tailored suit, stared at her as if seeing a ghost. Margaret Harrington's perfectly composed face showed cracks of what looked like fear rather than joy. And Thomas, her brother, now a young man of 23, took one look at her and practically fled the room. "We'll need to verify your claim, of course," Margaret said coldly, her voice at odds with the tears in her eyes. "DNA testing, background checks. We can't just accept that you're our Olivia without proof." "I've already done the DNA test," Emma replied, sliding the results across the mahogany table. "I'm your daughter. I'm Olivia." Richard picked up the papers with trembling hands. "It's really you," he whispered, but his voice held more dread than wonder. Emma had prepared herself for disbelief, for questions, for the awkwardness of reuniting with strangers who were supposed to be family. But she hadn't expected this peculiar mix of recognition and rejection. It was as if they'd seen a threatening ghost rather than their long-lost daughter. "Your room," Margaret said suddenly, her voice tight. "Would you like to see your room?" But when Emma moved to follow her mother up the grand staircase, she caught a glimpse of Margaret's hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. For a woman who'd appeared perfectly poised in every magazine photo and news clip Emma had studied, this small sign of distress spoke volumes. The bedroom was a time capsule of a 10-year-old girl's life, preserved with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Everything was exactly as the articles had described it: the white canopy bed, the shelf of dolphin figurines, the small grand piano in the corner. But something felt off. The room was too perfect, too untouched. It felt less like a shrine to a missing daughter and more like a carefully constructed stage set. As Emma ran her fingers along the piano keys, she heard voices drifting up from below, her parents, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "If she finds out the truth, we're ruined," Margaret's voice carried through the heating vent. "Everything we've built, everything we've protected, it will all fall apart." Emma stood very still, her heart pounding. The mystery of her disappearance hadn't ended with her return, it had only begun to unravel. And whatever truth lay at its center, her own parents seemed terrified of its discovery. In that moment, standing in a room that should have felt like coming home, Emma Brooks, once Olivia Harrington, realized that finding her true identity might cost her everything, including the answers she so desperately sought. The DNA test results lay on the breakfast table like a loaded gun. Margaret Harrington's perfectly manicured nails tapped against her untouched coffee cup as she studied them for the third time that morning. "I still think we should run our own tests," she said, her voice carrying that same strange edge that had been present since Emma's return. "You can never be too careful these days." Emma watched her biological mother from across the massive dining room, noting how the woman's shoulders tensed every time their eyes met. It had been 3 days since she'd moved into the Harrington mansion, and rather than growing more comfortable, the atmosphere had only become more suffocating. "The tests were done at one of the most reputable labs in Seattle," Emma replied carefully. "But if you'd like to run more, I'm happy to comply." She paused, then added, "Though I'm curious why you seem so reluctant to accept what's clearly true." Margaret's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. "Reluctant? Don't be ridiculous. We're simply being thorough. After 15 years, you can't expect us to just..." She trailed off as Thomas entered the room, still in his running clothes. Emma's younger brother took one look at them, grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl, and turned to leave. "Thomas," Emma called out, "maybe we could have lunch together today? I'd love to hear about your work at the foundation." "Busy," he muttered, not even turning around. "Maybe another time." The door closed behind him with a decisive click. Emma had tried to connect with her brother multiple times since her return, but he treated her like a virus he might catch if he got too close. For someone who'd grown up with a missing sister, he seemed remarkably uninterested in getting to know her now that she'd returned. Later that morning, Emma began exploring the mansion more thoroughly. The Harrington home was a maze of rooms and corridors, each more opulent than the last. But as she wandered, she noticed something odd. There were gaps in the family's photographic history. The walls were lined with perfectly spaced frames, but they told an incomplete story. There were photos from charity galas and business events, but personal family moments were surprisingly scarce. And in the photos that did exist, the time frames jumped oddly, from her 8th birthday directly to what appeared to be months after her disappearance. Looking for something specific? Emma startled at her father's voice. Richard Harrington stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Just trying to piece together memories, she said honestly. But it seems like there are some missing pieces. Quite a few, actually. Richard's face tightened. Your mother, she found it too painful. She put away anything that might trigger difficult memories. All of them? Every photo from a 2-year period? You don't understand what it was like. He snapped, then immediately composed himself. The media circus, the constant reminders. Sometimes removing things is the only way to cope. But Emma had worked as a journalist long enough to recognize evasion when she heard it. Her father was lying, or at least not telling the whole truth. The deeper she looked, the more irregularities she found. A sealed room on the 3rd floor that nobody would acknowledge. Missing pages from family albums. And most strikingly, the complete absence of any media coverage or family documentation from the 3 months leading up to her disappearance. That evening, Emma found herself in the mansion's vast library, searching through old newspapers on microfiche. The Harrington family had appeared regularly in the society pages, but here too, there was a gap. The coverage simply stopped for several months, then resumed with the story of her disappearance. You won't find what you're looking for in there. Emma turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway, his expression dark. It was the first time he'd voluntarily spoken to her since her return. And what am I looking for? She asked carefully. The truth. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. But you're searching in the wrong place. The real story isn't in what was published, it's in what was kept out of the papers. Before she could question him further, he turned and left, leaving Emma with more questions than answers. But his words confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. The Harringtons had gone to great lengths to control their narrative, both before and after her disappearance. That night, unable to sleep, Emma wandered the dark halls of the mansion. As she passed her parents' study, she heard voices. We need to handle this carefully, Margaret was saying, her voice tight with tension. If she starts digging into the Foundation's records from that period. She won't, Richard interrupted. Those records are sealed. Nobody can access them without. She's clever, Richard. Look how she found us. Look how much she's already discovered. And that room, we should have cleared it out years ago. It's too late now. Moving anything would only raise more suspicions. Emma pressed herself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The room they mentioned had to be the sealed one on the 3rd floor. Whatever secrets the Harringtons were hiding, that room held at least some of the answers. As she crept back to her bedroom, a floorboard creaked beneath her feet. From inside the study, the voices immediately stopped. There was a rustle of papers, the sound of a drawer slamming shut. Just the house settling, she heard her father say, but his voice was strained. Emma returned to her room, her mind racing. The missing photos, the sealed room, her brother's cryptic warning, her parents' midnight conversations, all of it pointed to something bigger than a simple kidnapping. The Harringtons weren't just afraid of the past coming to light, they were actively working to keep it buried. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Emma made a decision. Tomorrow, she would find a way into that sealed room, no matter the consequences. Whatever dark secrets her family was hiding, she deserved to know the truth, even if that truth destroyed everything in its wake. The lock on the third-floor room yielded surprisingly easily to the small set of picks Emma had brought from Seattle. Her hands were steady, a skill learned from a locksmith friend for a story she'd written about home security. Now, those same skills were about to help her unlock her own past. The door creaked open to reveal what looked like a private office, thick with dust but meticulously organized. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, and the air felt stale, untouched for years. Emma pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the space. The room was a time capsule, but not the kind meant to preserve happy memories. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their drawers labeled by year. A large desk dominated the center, its surface cleared except for a single leather-bound ledger. But it was the wall behind the desk that caught Emma's attention, a large cork board covered in documents, newspaper clippings, and photographs, all connected by red strings like something out of a detective movie. Her hands trembled as she approached the board. At its center was a photograph of her father with another man, both in expensive suits, shaking hands outside what appeared to be a courthouse. The date stamped showed it was taken just 2 weeks before her disappearance. Scrawled across the bottom in her father's handwriting were the words, "Final warning from Martinez. Deal must be completed by month's end." Emma began pulling open drawers, her journalist's instincts on high alert. In the first cabinet, she found stacks of financial records from 2010. As she skimmed the documents, her blood ran cold. The Harrington empire had been on the verge of collapse. Richard Harrington had borrowed millions from suspicious sources, making increasingly desperate attempts to keep his business afloat. Then she found it, a file labeled Insurance Policies. Inside was a document that made her sink to her knees. An insurance policy on her own life, taken out just months before her disappearance, worth $50 million. But that wasn't the worst part. Paperclipped to the policy was a handwritten note in her mother's elegant script. "Our Martinez won't wait. The policy is our only option. I've made arrangements. She won't suffer. It's better this way." With shaking hands, Emma continued her search. Hidden behind a false panel in one of the drawers, she found a stack of letters. They were correspondence between her mother and someone named Carlos Martinez, a man who appeared to be both a business associate and a threat to her father. The letters painted a damning picture. Richard Harrington had borrowed heavily from Martinez's organization, using questionable collateral. When he couldn't pay, Martinez had threatened to expose everything, which would have meant not just bankruptcy, but prison time for fraud. That's when Margaret had formulated her plan. The insurance policy, the staged kidnapping, the conveniently missing ransom note, it had all been orchestrated by her own mother. Margaret had seen her eldest child as a solution to their financial problems, calculating that the insurance payout would save the family's fortune and secure Thomas's future. A manila envelope at the bottom of the drawer contained the final pieces of the puzzle. Inside was a series of photographs showing Margaret meeting with 2 men in a parking garage, along with bank statements showing a payment of $100,000 to an offshore account. The date was 3 days before the cruise. The ransom demand had come, just as the police had suspected. But Margaret had intercepted it, paying the kidnappers extra to ensure Olivia would never be found. The plan had been perfect, except for one detail. The kidnappers, perhaps possessing more conscience than her own mother, hadn't followed through with their darker instructions. Instead, they'd delivered her to the Brooks family, giving her a chance at a new life. Emma's hands shook as she photographed everything with her phone. Each document, each letter, each damning piece of evidence told the story of a mother who had valued wealth and social standing over her own daughter's life. But there was one more revelation waiting. In the ledger on the desk, she found recent entries in her mother's handwriting. Margaret had been monitoring her, keeping tabs on Emma Brooks for years. She'd known exactly who and where her daughter was, yet had chosen to maintain the charade of grief and loss rather than risk exposure of her crimes. The final entry was dated just days before Emma had discovered her true identity. Doing well at Seattle Post. Won award for investigative journalism. Must ensure she never looks into missing persons cases. Too dangerous. A floorboard creaked behind her. Emma spun around, her phone's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate Thomas standing in the doorway. His face was a mask of anguish. "I was 12 when I found this room," he said quietly. "I've been carrying this secret for years, watching them play the grieving parents while knowing what they'd done to you." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "When you came back, I couldn't face you. How do you tell someone that your own mother tried to have them finished? You knew?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "All this time? I found the letters when I was in high school. I confronted Mom, but she convinced me it was the only way to save the family. She said you were happy with your new life, that revealing the truth would only hurt everyone." He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly young and lost. "I've been trying to make up for it ever since, donating to missing children's charities, helping other families. But I couldn't undo what she'd done." Emma stared at her brother, seeing him clearly for the first time. His distance wasn't rejection, it was guilt. He'd been carrying the weight of this knowledge alone for years, trapped between loyalty to their parents and the horror of what had been done to his sister. As the full impact of her discovery settled over her, Emma heard footsteps in the hallway below. The house was waking up, and soon her absence would be noticed. She had what she needed, evidence of a crime so monstrous it had torn apart two families. Now she had to decide what to do with it. The morning sun streamed through the conservatory windows, painting patterns on the marble floor as Emma waited. She'd chosen this room deliberately. It was Margaret's favorite spot for her morning tea, a ritual that hadn't changed in 15 years. Her phone lay on the table between them, recording every word. Margaret entered precisely at 9, elegant as always in her Chanel suit. She froze when she saw Emma sitting there, her usual composure flickering for just a moment before her society's smile slipped back into place. "You're up early, dear," Margaret said, moving toward her usual chair. "I hope you're settling in. How much was I worth?" Emma's voice cut through the air like a blade. $50 million in insurance, wasn't it? That's a lot of money to put on a 10-year-old's life." The teacup in Margaret's hand trembled slightly before she set it down. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you, Mother?" Emma spread the documents from the sealed room across the table. The insurance policy, the letters to Martinez, the offshore payment records. "Or should I refresh your memory about the parking garage meetings? The extra payment to make sure I'd never be found?" All color drained from Margaret's face as she stared at the evidence of her crimes. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. "You don't understand," Margaret finally whispered, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "We were going to lose everything. Richard's debts, the threats from Martinez, our whole world was collapsing. So you decided to sacrifice your daughter to save your lifestyle?" Emma's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "I was 10 years old. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Margaret's composure shattered completely. "Those men, they were supposed to make it look like an accident at sea. Quick, painless. I never wanted you to suffer." Emma felt the blood freeze in her veins. "As if that makes it better? You're actually sitting there trying to justify having your own child finished? You don't know what it was like." Margaret's voice rose hysterically. "Martinez was threatening to expose everything. Richard would have gone to prison. We would have lost the house, the company, our position in society. Thomas would have grown up in disgrace." She took a shuddering breath. "The insurance money was our only way out. One sacrifice to save the family. I was your family." Emma slammed her hand on the table, making the teacups rattle. "I was your daughter. You were an inconvenience." Margaret shot back, then immediately covered her mouth, horrified by her own words. The silence that followed was deafening. Through the windows, birds could be heard singing in the garden, oblivious to the decades of secrets unraveling in the room. "The men you hired," Emma said quietly, "they didn't follow through with your plan, did they? They had more humanity than you. They gave me to a family who actually loved me." Margaret's laugh was hollow. "Love? What good is love without position, without advantages? The Brooks gave you a mediocre life in a mediocre house with mediocre opportunities. I was trying to protect our legacy. By finishing me? By saving everyone else. Margaret stood, pacing the room like a caged animal. Do you know what would have happened if Martinez had exposed Richard's dealings? The scandal would have destroyed us all. Thomas would have lost his inheritance, his future. The Harrington name would have become a joke. I made the only choice I could. And after? When you discovered I was alive, living as Emma Brooks? The entries in your ledger show you knew exactly where I was. Margaret's face hardened. It was better that way. You had a new life, and we had survived. Opening old wounds would have served no purpose. Except justice, Emma said, reaching for her phone. Everything you've just said is recorded. Every confession, every justification for attempting to finish your own child. The color drained from Margaret's face. You wouldn't dare. Think about what this would do to your father, to Thomas. Like you thought about what your actions would do to me? Emma stood, towering over her mother. I spent 15 years wondering why I couldn't remember my past. Do you know what that's like? To have a void where your childhood should be? To feel like a part of you is missing but not know why? I can pay you, Margaret said desperately. Whatever the Brooks gave you, I can double it, triple it. Name your price. Emma stared at her mother in disgust. That's your solution? More money? Did you learn nothing in 15 years? What do you want from me? Margaret's voice cracked. An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. I'm sorry it didn't work the way it was supposed to. I'm sorry you had to live with those people. I'm sorry you found out the truth. Is that what you want to hear? What I want, Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, is for you to face the consequences of what you did. Not just to me, but to this entire family. You've lived with this secret for 15 years, watching Dad and Thomas suffer, knowing you were the cause of all their pain. Margaret sank back into her chair, suddenly looking old and defeated. You're going to destroy everything I tried to protect. No, Mother. You did that 15 years ago when you decided your social status was worth more than your daughter's life. Emma picked up her phone, stopping the recording. The police will be here soon. I suggest you use that time to think about what you're going to tell them. As if on cue, sirens could be heard in the distance. Margaret's shoulders slumped as the sound grew closer. I suppose, she said quietly. I always knew this day would come. I thought I'd be better prepared. Emma looked at the broken woman before her, this stranger who had given her life and then tried to take it away. Some things, she said softly, you can never really prepare for. The sirens grew louder, and in their wail, 15 years of secrets began their final unraveling. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Margaret Harrington was led away in handcuffs. Her designer suit and perfect posture couldn't mask the defeat in her eyes as the charges were read: conspiracy to fraud, money laundering, and a host of other crimes that carried a combined sentence of up to 30 years. Emma watched from a distance, standing between Sarah and James Brooks, her real parents in all the ways that truly mattered. The media circus had been relentless since the story broke, dubbing it the cruise ship conspiracy. Every newspaper and television station wanted an exclusive with the girl who had survived her own mother's plot. You don't have to stay for the sentencing, Sarah said softly, squeezing Emma's hand. You've done enough. But Emma stood her ground. I need to see this through, she replied, watching as her biological mother disappeared into the courthouse. For that little girl on the cruise ship who didn't understand why her world was being torn apart. Inside the courtroom, Richard Harrington sat with his head bowed, looking decades older than his years. The investigation had revealed that while he hadn't known about Margaret's plot, his fraudulent business dealings had set the whole tragedy in motion. He'd agreed to testify against his wife in exchange for a reduced sentence, but the guilt of his indirect role in his daughter's near-death had broken him completely. Thomas sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, away from both parents. In the months since Emma's discovery, he had thrown himself into making amends. He'd turned over years of documentation that helped build the case against their mother, and had started a foundation dedicated to helping families of missing children. The weight of his childhood secret had finally lifted, allowing him to begin his own healing process. When Margaret was led to the stand for her final statement, the courtroom fell silent. She turned to face Emma, her carefully maintained facade cracking for the first time in public. "I won't ask for forgiveness," she said, her voice trembling. "What I did was unforgivable. I told myself I was protecting our family, our legacy. But in trying to preserve our way of life, I destroyed something far more precious." She paused, tears falling freely now. "I lost the right to call myself your mother long ago. The Brooks family gave you what I never could, unconditional love." The judge's sentence was severe, 25 years without possibility of parole. As Margaret was led away, she stopped briefly beside Emma. "I hope," she whispered, "you find all the happiness I was too blind to give you." After the sentencing, Emma found Thomas waiting outside the courthouse. The awkwardness between them had slowly evolved into a tentative bond over their shared trauma. "What will you do now?" he asked, both of them watching as reporters swarmed around Margaret's departing prison transport. "Go home," Emma replied simply. "My real home in Seattle." Thomas nodded, understanding. "The foundation. I'd like you to be part of it. Not because of our blood connection, but because you understand better than anyone what these families go through. We could help people together." Emma smiled, seeing in her brother the good man he'd become despite their parents' toxic influence. "I'd like that. But from Seattle. My life is there." Later that evening, Emma stood in her childhood bedroom in the Harrington mansion one last time. The room that had been preserved like a museum piece now felt like what it truly was, a shrine to a life that had been stolen, not just by her disappearance, but by the cold calculations of wealth and status. She packed a few small mementos, the stuffed dolphin that had traveled with her unknowingly from her past life, a few photographs of happier times before greed had poisoned everything. The rest she left behind. The Harrington fortune, the social status, the legacy that her mother had valued above her daughter's life, none of it held any appeal. Sarah and James Brooks were waiting in the foyer, looking somewhat out of place in the grand mansion. Emma had worried that the revelation of their role in her story might lead to legal troubles, but both Margaret's confession and the statute of limitations had protected them. More importantly, their genuine love and care for her had been evident to everyone involved in the case. "Ready to go home, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, holding out her hand. Emma took one last look around the mansion. Richard had signed it over to Thomas, along with control of what remained of the family business after the legal settlements. Her brother had already announced plans to turn it into a center for missing children's resources and family reunification services. "Yes," Emma said firmly, taking her mother's hand. "I'm ready to go home." As they drove away from the Harrington estate, Emma felt the weight of the past 15 years finally beginning to lift. She was no longer Olivia Harrington, the heiress who had vanished at sea, nor was she simply Emma Brooks, the girl with the mysterious past. She had become someone entirely new, a survivor who had uncovered the truth, brought justice to light, and found her way back to the only family that had ever truly loved her. The sun was setting over Seattle when they finally reached the Brooks' modest house with its small garden and warm kitchen where she had grown up. The contrast with the cold grandeur of the Harrington mansion couldn't have been starker. Here, there were no marble floors or crystal chandeliers, but there was something far more valuable: unconditional love and acceptance. As Emma walked through the familiar front door, she smiled at the family photos on the walls, real moments of joy and connection, not carefully staged portraits designed to project wealth and status. Sarah and James had given her something Margaret Harrington had never understood: a home where love wasn't measured in dollar signs or social standing. "Welcome home," James said softly, squeezing her shoulder. Emma looked at her parents, her real parents, and felt tears of gratitude in her eyes. The truth had finally set her free, not just from the mystery of her past, but from the burden of belonging to a family that had valued appearances over love. In solving the mystery of her disappearance, she had found her way back to where she truly belonged. The girl who vanished on the cruise ship had finally completed her journey home.